Good evening, everyone. A quick housekeeping matter. I was asked to remind folks that there are refreshments in the back room for those interested, so thank you for that. My name is Nico Papakostandis, and I have the honor of chairing the Town of Exeter Select Board. And on behalf of the Select Board, we would like to welcome you to the Town of Exeter, the revolutionary capital of New Hampshire. We also welcome the many elected and appointed state and local officials in attendance this evening. In 1776, months before independence was declared, Exeter became the seat of revolutionary government to New Hampshire. Ordinary citizens and their leaders accepted the extraordinary responsibility of imagining what government by the people could look like and put those ideas in writing. Though not perfect or final, the first written state constitution was bold. The citizens of Exeter continue to play a vital role in the nation's history through their heroic achievements in the Revolutionary War. Over time, though Exeter was no longer the state capital, Exeter remained vital in Rockingham County. By the end of the 18th century, Exeter became the home of Phillips Exeter Academy, well-known, attractive, and an important element in town to this day. The 19th century saw slow but steady growth, our first bank, our first library, police station. This very town hall that we're enjoying this evening, built in 1855, and it's incredibly humbling for me to have the privilege to stand before you on the same stage on which President Lincoln once spoke. The Exeter newsletter also started, and we enjoy reading the Exeter newsletter to this day. And we share a similar type of government folks did in Exeter back then, whereby the citizens, the legislative body, gather once a year to debate, deliberate, and vote at annual town meeting. And I think I can honestly say that some of the budgetary challenges they had then, we still enjoy today. Here we are 5 days into 2026, and it is incredibly exciting to begin a year-long celebration of our democratic heritage. Last year, the Town of Exeter Select Board established an Exeter 250 Celebration Commission, tasking the volunteers appointed to the committee to organize and coordinate programs to celebrate the founding of the great experiment of democracy. Plans are already underway for more exciting celebrations throughout the year, and we hope that you'll enjoy them. Before we begin the program this evening, I would like to recognize and thank a few people. I'd like to thank the Town of Exeter Town Manager's Office and Parks and Recreation Department for facilitating the utilization of this building. I'd like to thank the Police Department, the Fire Department. I'd like to thank the American Independence Museum and the Exeter Historical Society for their long-standing partnership with the Town of Exeter. And I'd like to thank the Exeter 250 Celebration Commission, all the volunteer members led by their co-chairs, Francois, Elise, and Karen Pryor. Finally, many thanks to all of you for joining us this evening to celebrate America's first Constitution. We are grateful you are here and proud to share this evening with you. And at this time, it is my privilege to introduce the President of the American Independence Museum Board of Governors, New Hampshire Superior Court Chief Justice Mark Howard.
All right, thank you, Nico, and welcome to everyone to this special occasion celebrating the 250th anniversary of New Hampshire's first Constitution. The document we have here in front of us, well, okay, this is the replica. The one to the side is the original document. It was completed 250 years ago today, no more than a few hundred feet behind you off to your left shoulder. In an area of Exeter now known as the Townhouse Common. The townhouse used to sit there just across Front Street here, and that's where the document was written. Before I introduce our speakers tonight, I want to take a moment to offer a few acknowledgments. First, to the New Hampshire Supreme Court Society. The Society is a nonprofit organization committed to increasing public awareness of the life of the law, the importance of having educated citizens who understand our Constitution, and the need for civics education. Thanks to their generous sponsorship of this event, the American Independence Museum was able to offer tonight's program free to the public. To the New Hampshire Secretary of State, David Scanlon, and the State Archivist, Ashley Miller, who is also a member of the Independence Museum Board. The document is under their perpetual care at the State Archives, and we are grateful to them for arranging to have the document here tonight. To the 1st New Hampshire Regiment, gentlemen, thank you for coming out to stand guard of this treasured document and bring a bit of history to life here. And finally, to Joe Pace, our Executive Director of the Independence Museum. In early 2025, the American Independence Museum made what has proved already to be one of its most consequential decisions. We hired Joe as our Executive Director. Joe has brought an exceptional level of professionalism, vision, and passion to the work of the museum. Because of Joe, you can expect so many more programs just like this one. The American Independence Museum is pleased to present to you tonight 2 accomplished experts on the history and development of the New Hampshire Constitution. First, my colleague on the Superior Court, the Honorable N. William Delker, is an Associate Justice of the New Hampshire Superior Court, where he has served for nearly 15 years. Prior to joining the bench, Judge Delker was a law clerk for the New Hampshire Supreme Court and was a Senior Assistant Attorney General at the Attorney General's office in Concord, where he worked as a prosecutor for nearly 13 years. Judge Delker has taught state constitutional law at both the UNH School of Law and the New England School of Law for the past 15 years. He teaches many continuing legal education courses on this topic. Judge Delker earned his Juris Doctor degree summa cum laude from American University's Washington College of Law, and his undergraduate degree summa cum laude from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. UNH is still better. Professor Lawrence Friedman is a professor of law at New England Law, Boston, where he teaches courses in constitutional law, state constitutional law, civil procedure, and privacy law. He is the author of a textbook on modern constitutional law and the co-author of State Constitutional Law Cases and Materials. In addition, he edits the Oxford University Press series on the state constitutions and wrote the volume on the New Hampshire Constitution. And I've let Professor Friedman know that that is the only book that sits on my desk at the court. Some would say that tracks. Before joining the New England Law faculty, Professor Friedman was a visiting professor of law at Boston College Law School and a lecturer at Harvard Law School. Prior to his academic career, he engaged in the private practice of law in Boston and served as a law clerk with both the New Hampshire Superior and Supreme Courts. Professor Friedman holds law degrees from Harvard Law School and the Boston College School of Law and an undergraduate degree from Connecticut College. By the summer of 1775, a few months after the shot heard round the world at Lexington and Concord on April 19th of 1775, conditions in the colonies were volatile. New Hampshire was no exception. Our colonial governor, John Wentworth, was rapidly losing his ability to assert British authority in New Hampshire. Indeed, things were occasionally violent, and he had cause to be concerned for his safety and the life of his family. On the evening of June 13th of 1775, Governor Wentworth received word that his home, the governor's mansion in Portsmouth, was going to be attacked. Moments later, an angry mob had assembled outside the mansion, demanding that Governor Wentworth hand over to them a British loyalist who was in the mansion with Governor Wentworth. Wentworth went to the door and refused to surrender the loyalist. The mob grew angrier and began pounding on the mansion with clubs. Indeed, they drew up a cannon and pointed it at the door. warning Wentworth that unless he surrendered the Loyalists, no one in the house would survive. The Loyalist took it upon himself to surrender. As soon as the mob took the Loyalist away, Wentworth gathered his wife and infant son and rushed out the back of the house and down to the South Mill Pond in Portsmouth, where they boarded a boat and hurried toward Fort William and Mary on Newcastle Island, which we now know as Fort Constitution. There they boarded the British ship, the HMS Scarborough, where they remained for nearly a month before sailing to Boston, thus ending the presence of British authority in New Hampshire.
Woo-hoo!
That's all. With the colonial governor gone, the provincial assembly needed to turn its attention to governing New Hampshire. On December 21st, 1775, they convened here in Exeter, and 2 weeks later, on January 5th, 1776, our first Constitution was breathed into life. One of my favorite lines in the temporary Constitution of 1776 is that its creation, according to its authors, was necessitated by the sudden and abrupt departure of our colonial governor Wentworth. Nothing will cause a sudden and abrupt departure more than having a cannon pointed at you. Ladies and gentlemen, Judge Delker and Professor Friedman in Congress at Exeter.
Thank you, Your Honor, for that very generous introduction. And I think I speak for Judge Delker when I say this is amazing to see all of you here, and we are thrilled to be a part of it. This morning, I taught my first constitutional law class of the semester, and I begin constitutional law each time by asking the students what makes constitutional law important. Why is constitutional law different from the other kinds of law that you will study in law school? And eventually, they come to the realization that the Constitution provides the structure of government. Now, the Constitution that most of us are familiar with is the US Constitution, and it's probably fair to say that most people are not aware that their state has a constitution, much less what that constitution says. Judge Delker and I live in the world of state constitutional law. Both of us have taught it, written about it, and thought about it a lot. And it's particularly a privilege to be here tonight because New Hampshire played such an important role, not just in the development of the national constitution, but in state constitutional law more generally. New Hampshire holds the honor of having the first state constitution, as Judge Howard just explained, and the constitution that replaced it, the Constitution of 1784, is still the constitution in force today, making it the second oldest written constitution in the world after the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780. And tonight we're going to talk a little bit about that first constitution, the emergency constitution, how it came about, and what it means, and we're also going to talk about what it might have meant, not just what it might have meant to the people of New Hampshire at the time, but what we can learn from it today. With that, let's begin.
So, all I want to say is, wow, this is amazing. Thank you all for coming, and I hope in this year of the 250th, I'm not going to say it right, but the semi-quincentennial celebration of our nation's independence, that this will be the first of many opportunities that we have to gather to share those things that bind us together as a nation, those values that make us Americans. And I think two of those values are found in the document we're going to talk about tonight, and that is independence and the right to self-government. And I thought, so what my remarks here at the beginning of this are going to take you through some of the history that got us up to the date of January 5th, 1776. And as I was sort of contemplating tonight's remarks, I was thinking, why is New Hampshire's role in the American War of Independence so little understood? And I think it's because we didn't produce any of those towering personalities that we're all familiar with. We don't have a rabble-rouser like Samuel Adams. We don't have the vaunted intellectuals like John and Abigail Adams. We don't have a tragic figure like Alexander Hamilton that it's easy to write a Broadway play about. Our revolutionaries here in New Hampshire were just regular citizens. They were merchants, they were farmers, they were doctors, they were lawyers, trying desperately to hold on to the liberties in the face of a threat of royal authority. And a lot of the people that we'll talk about tonight, probably some of you may recognize the names. Maybe you recognize the names simply from the towns that were named after them. But likely, if you know any of these names, whether it's Josiah Bartlett or Matthew Thornton, William Whipple, John Langdon, or Nicholas Gilman, it's because their names are affixed to the national documents, the U.S. Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. But all of these individuals played a really critical role in the foundation of New Hampshire, which took the first step towards independence, as I'll talk about here in a minute. And perhaps one of the people who's most forgotten is an individual named Meshach Ware. Meshach Ware held literally every major political position in New Hampshire from 1775 to 1785, often at the same time, which was a point of contention. And the tragedy about Meshach Ware is, and he ran things well. I mean, throughout this period of time, he was the president of the council. He was the chairman of the Committee on Safety. He was the Chief Justice of the court. And all through this period of the Revolution, he did such a good job that he was elected to be our first formal governor, actually then called president of the state of New Hampshire. And the tragedy about Meshach Ware is we don't even know what he looks like. There's no known photograph of him, or not photograph, but portrait or image of him. And so I hope that our remarks tonight will help you better appreciate the work of these little known or even unknown figures who made New Hampshire first in the nation from its very beginning. So I'm going to take you back in time to, see if I can get this to work. Ah, there we go. To the beginnings of New Hampshire. So many of you may remember New Hampshire history. Probably some of you know New Hampshire history far better than I do. Some of you, it may be a dim memory from when you visited the State House in the 4th grade. But just to remind you, to put us all on the same page. So New Hampshire was first settled in 1623. And for the first 120 years or so of our history, we had a fairly fraught relationship with Massachusetts. At points in time, I know things don't change, right? For points in time, we shared a governor with Massachusetts. There was a brief period of time under royal authority that they even tried to have a New England-wide colony. But our story really picks up with the appointment of Benning Wentworth in 1741, and then upon his retirement, the appointment of his nephew, John Wentworth, who Judge Howard talked about a few minutes ago. And the reason these two are important to talk about is because for about 35 years, they held a very tight control over government in New Hampshire. And they did that through a variety of different means, but primarily it was by handing out plum assignments of political positions to relatives and supporters. And the other thing that they did is granted huge tracts of New Hampshire land, again, to relatives and supporters, and kept also huge tracts of land for themselves so that they became incredibly wealthy. But through these means, they were able to maintain fairly tight control over New Hampshire for this entire period of 35 years. But things really began to slide out of their control, or particularly Governor John Wentworth's control, in the 1770s. And so I'm going to pick our story up with the Boston Tea Party, which was in December of 1773. And in response to the Boston Tea Party, the British Parliament passed what is known as the Boston Port Act. And the Boston Port Act essentially shut down the port of Boston to all commercial trade until reparations were paid for the tea that was thrown overboard. And that was perhaps one of those sparks that really set not just the rebels in Massachusetts, the patriots in Massachusetts, ablaze, but sparked a flame across the colonies, because cities like Portsmouth, which was a significant commercial port, and many others up and down the seacoast said, well, if you can do that to Boston, what stops you from doing that to us? And so that began the effort to coordinate the efforts among the colonies. And that first effort happened, the first effort here in New Hampshire happened in May of 1774. So one of the ways the royal governors controlled authority is through a general assembly. So we had a legislature of sorts, but it isn't a legislature, as I'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a couple of minutes, like we think about. It really was a legislature that was largely under the control of the governor, but this legislature voted in May of 1774 to set up a committee of correspondence. And a committee of correspondence was an effort to, as it suggests, to correspond with the other colonies and to coordinate efforts to how they were going to respond to the encroaching British authority. Well, Governor Wentworth, as you can imagine, was not too thrilled about this move of a body that was supposed to be under his control. And so he attempted to dissolve the General Assembly and tell them, and that was one of the ways he could control them, was to say, okay, you're disbanded, you can't meet anymore. Well, they refused to leave the hall in Portsmouth, and he had to come in with the sheriff and threaten to arrest them all if they didn't disband. And so they didn't give up that easily. What they did is they left Representative Hall and went down the street to a tavern, and there, all good things happen. And there they voted to create the first provincial Congress. And so the provincial Congress, for some reason my PowerPoint's not working, maybe I can get some help here. Anyway, the provincial Congress, they met nearby. The provincial Congress then, they voted to create the provincial Congress, which took place in July of 1774. And they purposely decided not to sit in Portsmouth, because Portsmouth was the seat of royal authority, was really a loyalist stronghold. So they decided to convene here in Exeter. And their purpose in convening was to elect delegates to go to the Continental Congress, which was meeting down in Philadelphia at Carpenter's Hall. And so they elected John Sullivan and Nathaniel Folsom to go and become our first delegates to the Continental Congress down there in Philadelphia. And the first effort at armed resistance came in December of 1774. So we all probably remember this midnight ride of Paul Revere, but most people don't know that Paul Revere took a daytime ride to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, 4 months before the shot heard round the world on April 19th, 1775. He rode to Portsmouth, New Hampshire to warn the Patriots that the British were going to take the gunpowder that was sitting at Fort William and Mary, and they were going to remove it from the fort. And so Paul Revere met with John Langdon and John Sullivan on December 13th, 1774, and warned them about this. John Sullivan and Langdon then gathered a group of about 400 soldiers to march on the fort. The fort was lightly defended. There was only about a half a dozen soldiers there at the time, so they were able to easily take it. But it was a significant event because they took captive the officer in charge of the fort, they pulled down the British colors, and they removed 100 barrels of gunpowder. Governor Wentworth obviously not happy about these developments, tried to call out the militia, and they refused to respond. And so the Patriots, emboldened by this, returned the next day and then removed many of the cannons from Fort William and Mary. And I don't know that those were the ones you pointed at Governor Wentworth's house. That'd be a great detail to add. But they were used at the Siege of Boston several months later, or later in 1775. So Governor Wentworth isn't totally giving up hope yet to regain control. So on the side, as I said, meeting here in Exeter, we have the Provincial Congress. A second Provincial Congress meets in January of 1775 to elect new delegates. This time, again, it's actually, again, Sullivan and Langdon, who go to the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. And then we have the famous shot heard round the world. And New Hampshire responds, the Provincial Congress responds immediately with that. Within 3 days, the call goes out to elect delegates, and they convene here again in Exeter, and they immediately began to provision the troops that had marched to the support of their comrades in arms in Massachusetts. And here's I think a good opportunity to kind of talk a little bit about the difference between the General Assembly that I had talked about earlier and the Provincial Congress that the Patriots had set up. So the General Assembly was really, as I said, a tool for royal control. It was not particularly representative. There were, at the time in 1775, about 155 towns in this province of New Hampshire, the colony of New Hampshire. Only 36 towns were represented in the General Assembly. And there was only one delegate for each town, regardless of how big those towns were. In contrast, the Provincial Congress had, by the Fourth Provincial Congress, which I'll get to here in a minute, there were over 151 delegates from over 100 towns represented. And the General Assembly, almost all of the delegates came from within 10 miles of Portsmouth, in contrast to the Provincial Congress, which was led by the Patriots, in which only a quarter of the delegates came from the vicinity of Portsmouth. So you can see there's a significant shift in the power base from the royal authority to the Provincial Congress that's occurring during this period of time. So what Governor Wentworth tries to do is he tries to exercise his authority to say, okay, I'm going to go to the people, I'm going to have this body that, at least on paper, looks like a representative body, reconvene, and try to get some laws passed to arrest the perpetrators of the siege of William and Mary. And I also am going to try to make sure that this happens by packing the court, so to speak. So what he did was he expanded the size of the General Assembly at this point in time in May of 1775 to include representatives from 3 towns which he had granted these large land grants to. So he knew these were people who were particularly favorable to his point of view. So as he's in the process of convening the General Assembly, the Battle of Bunker Hill breaks out, and that doesn't help matters for Governor Wentworth, as you can imagine. New Hampshire's very own 1st Regiment fought bravely along the flank with General John Stark and held the British from outflanking the Americans there at the Battle of Bunker Hill. And so tensions are high during this period of time. But what happens is, in the General Assembly, the delegates who were elected, who had been sitting, refused to allow Wentworth's new delegates to be seated. And one of those people was the loyalist that Chief Justice Howard talked about. His name was John Fenton. And he wasn't going to take matters lying down. He was from Portsmouth. He stood up in the House of Representatives to try to defend his position, and he was harangued out of the building. He was harassed to the point where he had to flee to Governor Wentworth's mansion, as we heard about a few minutes ago. And I'll repeat the story, but that's when Governor Wentworth and his wife, Lady Frances Wentworth, and their young child were forced to flee That happened on June 13th, 1775. By June 15th, they went to Fort William and Mary, and by August 24th of 1775, they were on the ship out of Portsmouth Harbor, never to return. And so that brings us to the need to transition from royal authority, because we have none at this point. New Hampshire had no charter, it had no governing document, it was all by royal prerogative. And so the 4th Provincial Congress meets here in Exeter from May to November. And this body is significantly different than the earlier provincial congresses. Those had met for very specific purposes. The first two to elect delegates to the Continental Congress, and the third one to support the troops at the Battle of Lexington and Concord. But this is the first real effort to set up government in New Hampshire. It meets for the entire period of time from May to November of 1775. And as I talked about before, it's considerably more representative than the General Assembly. And it says, you know, it decides, you know, we don't really have any authority to govern here. You know, we're kind of in uncharted territory. So what they do is they turn to the Continental Congress, and on July 8th, 1775, they petition the Continental Congress to ask for permission to set up a civil government here. And between July and November of that year, or October of that year rather, the New Hampshire delegates in Philadelphia lobby their colleagues for an opportunity, permission to set up the New Hampshire government, because we have none. They're essentially doing an ad hoc thing with the Provincial Congress. And that permission comes on November 3rd, 1775. And it's worth reading. It's relatively short. On November 3rd, 1775, it says, Congress, taking into consideration the report of the Committee of New Hampshire Instructions, resolved that it be recommended to the Provincial Convention of New Hampshire to call a full representation of the people, and that the representatives, if they think it necessary, establish such form of government as in their judgment will best produce the happiness of the people and most effectually secure peace and good order in the province during the continuance of the present dispute between Great Britain and the colonies. And so that's the resolution. So Langdon and Bartlett, who were the delegates down in Philadelphia, wrote immediately home that very same day to tell their colleagues about their success. And this is a book of the provincial papers. I promise I won't read the whole thing. But I think it's helpful to hear from in their own words about what they understood that they had accomplished by this move to set up government in New Hampshire. And so they wrote home, and I'm going to read the letter. It's not very long again. It says, it's dated November 3rd, 1775, and it says, Sir, this serves to enclose a resolve of the Congress relative to civil government for the colony of New Hampshire, by which you'll see they recommend such form of government as shall be agreeable to a free representation of the people. In short, such government as shall be most agreeable to the province. The argument on this matter, being the first of its kind, as we had no charter, was truly Ciceronial. The eminent speakers did honor to themselves and the continent, carried by a very great majority. The power is ample and full, even to the choice of governor, if the colony should think it necessary, but that we humbly conceive worthy of consideration. You'll see that the government is limited to the present contest, to ease the minds of some few people who are fearful of independence. We thought it advisable not to oppose that part too much, for once we had taken any sort of government, nothing but negotiation with Great Britain can alter it. We would beg leave to suggest whether a government somewhat similar to Massachusetts, again our fraught relationship with our sister to the south, would be best. A free representation of the province, though not too many, as they may be increased at any time, but a proper number, but would be hard to diminish. Those representatives to choose a council of a proper number, say 15, these two branches to act in all cases whatever, and not proceed so far as governor at present, though the door may be left open for that purpose. We throw out these hints with great submission to the Honorable Convention. We think we can say without boasting, having done our duty to this matter by paying constant attention for a long time, not only in the House, but in private conversations with members, to clear up any doubts they may have on this head. We can't help rejoicing to see this as groundwork for our government and hope by the blessing of divine providence never to return to our former despotic state. So, language department knew what they were doing was declaring independence 6 months before any other state was doing it. But they had to cloak it in this language of compromise because they had to bring the doubters along. And I'll show as a little bit later why I know that to be true from what even the opponents of the Constitution were talking about. So to get to the document itself, Congress didn't waste any time getting to business. The 4th Provincial Congress voted to create a committee to frame a government for the people. On the 14th of November, they adopted the following voting rules for this new convention. So every legal inhabitant paying taxes shall be a voter. So under royal authority, you needed to have at least 50 pounds, I believe was the number, but you needed to have some amount of property in order to vote. So this was not a property requirement. Any elected representative must own 200 pounds of real estate. Under royal authority, the representatives have to own 300 pounds of real estate. No representative could be seated who bribed voters with liquor. Each town, and then they set up a framework to have towns represented by the number of inhabitants in each town, and they created a complicated scheme. I don't need to go through it now, but it basically was much more representative than the former General Assembly I talked about. And then they resolved that the 5th Provincial Congress, which would come next, would frame that government. They would write that document we're talking about here today, and then they would become the House of Representatives that would fill the role of being that government. And so then on the 15th day of November, the 4th Congress dissolved itself, and the 5th Congress came together on December 21st, so we're talking lickety-split in the days before the internet. Word got out, and they pulled together the 5th Provincial Congress. They met here in Exeter. They elected Matthew Thornton as its president. They appointed a committee in 3 days, and they voted on January 5th, 1776 to adopt the document that Professor Friedman is going to talk to us in more detail about.
Okay, so now we have the Constitution of 1776, the first new constitution in what will be the United States of America. 6 months, as Judge Delker said before, the Declaration of Independence. We have the document that is right over there. It's fewer than 1,000 words, and it doesn't look exactly, or really at all, like the modern constitutions we're used to. It doesn't look like the U.S. Constitution, and it doesn't look like the New Hampshire Constitution of 1784. It was designed with a particular purpose, and that was to get New Hampshire a structure of government to help it survive what they knew was coming. What was coming was rebellion, the revolution. At the same time, even at this stage, independence was not a certainty, and there were, as Judge Delker said, doubters. So it's an outline of government that contains no Bill of Rights. There's a House of Representatives, which will be elected by voters. There's a council which acts like a Senate with 12 members, initially chosen by the House and later by popular vote. No governor and no chief executive officer. This is a frame of government that was designed, obviously, based on the circumstances that the individuals who were writing it were facing. they had just been through, as we learned, this experience with royal government. And they thought that they could survive without a governor or any person who represented the king. They also, it's important to remember, were not at all sure how long they were going to need this government to last. So they needed something that was pragmatic and that was quick. A lot of the document is the preamble. The preamble rehearses a number of the grievances that will seem familiar to anyone who has read the Declaration of Independence. It talks about how the British Parliament deprived us of our national constitutional rights and privileges. The British ministry sent an army and navy to enforce its acts. The military exercised a wanton and cruel abuse of their power in destroying the lives and properties of the colonists in many places with fire and sword. It took ships and cargo from many honest, industrious, and law-abiding merchants. Governor Wentworth and members of his council suddenly fled, creating no ability to legislate, leaving us essentially without a government. The courts are closed, we can't punish criminal offenders, we expose the lives and property of honest people to the machinations and evil designs of wicked men. Probably most of them from Massachusetts. And so, we need to form a government in order to continue to live our lives. And as Judge Delker said, there was nothing to fall back on in New Hampshire because unlike the other colonies, unlike Massachusetts, for example, there was no royal charter that at least provided some framework that would allow people to continue to live through their days. The colony, of course, never sought to throw off our dependence upon Great Britain and would rejoice if there could be a reconciliation approved by the Continental Congress. So you've got a couple of things going on here. One is the grievances that animated so many New Hampshire citizens about life under the royal regime. But still a token to the doubters and the loyalists who wanted there to be some reconciliation with Great Britain, although it is clear, as Judge Delker Hassan will explain, where this was headed. That's a big chunk of that document right there. And we haven't even gotten to how they're going to govern themselves. So how are they going to govern themselves? Here's the structure of government. Instead, as I said, of three independent branches of government, there's going to be the House of Representatives from the delegates elected to the 5th Provincial Congress. There's going to be a separate council that will be a branch of the legislature with 12 members. All bills to become law must be passed by both branches. Public and military officers will be appointed by both branches. Judges will appoint clerks of court. County treasurer and recorder of deeds will be elected by the voters in each county. Budget bills must originate in the House. Neither branch can adjourn for more than 10 days without the consent of the other. And if the conflict with Great Britain happens to last more than a year, the legislature will be elected by the voters. The election will be called by the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate, and the votes returned by a certain date. There's not much more to it. And this was the document that would govern New Hampshire up until the eventual ratification of the Constitution of 1784. It was unwieldy, and it was inefficient, but it was a government, and it was a structure. And I think there's a lot to learn, especially today, about the way in which constitutions become part of the cultural fabric of the community that adopt them. This was a constitution that was created in a very short period of time, in a period of crisis. As we said, it wasn't intended to last very long, but it was adapted and used to get the colony now state of New Hampshire through until the time that New Hampshire became the first state to use methods of popular origination for a constitution. This led to all of the debates about this constitution and all of the disputes between the different parts of New Hampshire, and the towns about who should be represented led to a very long process by which the Constitution was debated not by a legislature, but by a convention of the people represented by delegates sent from all of the towns. This was an innovation. No constitution had ever come about this way. And as Judge Delker said, New Hampshire didn't have statesmen like John Adams, who was an extraordinary person and would be an extraordinary person in any age, but had ordinary people who rose to the task of figuring out how to move forward in this time of exigency. And they did it in a way, and over a time, that emphasizes something that is common to all constitutions, the first one, and particularly the second one, which is an emphasis on process and inclusion, and making sure that all the voices were heard from across the state in the creation of a government that they hoped would last for a long time. Not for nothing, this was also the prelude to independence. Those grievances, as I said, sound familiar to anyone who has read the Declaration of Independence, because they were on the minds of colonists across the United States. Where are we now? You want to pick it up?
So it wasn't all huzzahs on January 5th, 1776. There were, as Professor Friedman said, some very significant doubters. Approximately a third of the 5th Provincial Congress voted against adopting a constitution at all. And even the opponents understood what this step meant in terms of our break with Great Britain. So a couple of efforts came around to try to overturn the Constitution. First, representatives from 12 different towns filed a motion to reconsider adopting a constitution. And they had a number of objections. I'll put one of them up here in a minute, but I want to get to the ones that were probably less convincing. So they listed 9 total objections or bases for a motion to reconsider. Judge Howard knows lots about motions to reconsider. And some of these are more convincing than others. So number 3, probably not so convincing. It says, third, because the colonies of New York and Virginia, which are under similar circumstances with us, are much larger and more opulent, and we presume much wiser, to whom we should pay all due deference, have not attempted anything of the kind, nor can we learn ever desired it. Number 5, because it appears assuming for so small and inconsiderable a colony to take the lead in a matter of so great an importance. And then number 9, to get to the heart of the matter, because it appears to us too much like setting up independency from the mother country. So they knew what they were doing. And it wasn't just the delegates who voted to reconsider. Town meetings, Portsmouth, I told you, was a loyalist stronghold. Well, Portsmouth convened a town meeting just days after January 5th. And they voted and sent out a petition to the surrounding towns to petition the legislature to reconsider as well. And in their words, they said, we humbly conceive that such a measure is an open declaration of independency, which we can no means countenance until we shall know the sentiments of the British nation in general. And so the legislature said, well, what do we do with these objections? They decided to say, well, let's throw this back to the Continental Congress. They got us into this mess by giving us permission to set up government. So they sent a letter down to the delegates, Langdon and at that point Bartlett, and they just squashed it. They're like, we're not presenting this to our colleagues. This is ridiculous. And so these efforts went nowhere, and government stayed in New Hampshire. But that wasn't the only objection. Actually, 4 days after that document was adopted, the leading newspaper here in New Hampshire, which was called the New Hampshire Gazette and Historical Chronicle, ran a front-page open letter to the legislature objecting to the newly adopted Constitution. And in that, authored by anonymous author Junius, he recognized that this vote itself was a first step towards independence and urged people to vote against it and to oppose it and to seek to overturn it. An interesting side note is the new provincial Congress didn't sort of quite take freedom of the press as sacredly as we did at the time. They voted to haul the publisher, Daniel Foley, before the legislature to answer for publishing this piece and give an account of the author of the piece, in other words, who wrote it, and further answering for his printing of the piece, so much derogatory to the honor of this assembly, as well as the Honorable Continental Congress, and injurious to the cause of liberty now contending for. So again, a sign that they understood that this was about the move to liberty. So I wasn't able to discover what happened with this issue with Mr. Foley, but an interesting aside, this wasn't the first time Mr. Foley got hauled before a legislature. He was from Massachusetts, where he wrote a pamphlet back in the 1750s or 60s, 1750s, I think, railing against some rum excise tax that the legislature had adopted. And they actually imprisoned, the legislature in Massachusetts actually imprisoned Foley, put him on trial, and he escaped to New Hampshire where he set up shop here and didn't bend his ways. So the next step is the path to a permanent solution. So Professor Friedman's going to take us through the years 1776 to 84 to talk about sort of how we got from that temporary document we're talking about to the permanent document that we operate still under today.
As I mentioned, this was a process, and the process was intended to be inclusive, but it did take a number of years. In 1778, there was a first constitutional convention, and again, this is the first time that a constitution had been drafted or proposed using a convention that's popularly chosen. It didn't work. There were several other tries between 1781 and 1783, and while the Constitution of 1783 would ultimately be adopted in much the same form in 1784, those efforts also failed. And a number of historians have looked into the reason for the failure, especially because we know that the 1783 Constitution was virtually identical to what was ultimately adopted, and inclusion was really the key. Just as Governor Wentworth had excluded certain towns and certain citizens in the General Assembly, the early convention efforts did not sufficiently include representatives from all parts of New Hampshire. Once that was accomplished, the Constitution was eventually ratified on June 2nd, 1784, becoming the document that still governs New Hampshire today. The second oldest written constitution. I hesitate to say this, but it was modeled in large part on the Massachusetts Constitution. But that's really a feature and not a bug. And I want to connect this back to what Judge Delker said in his opening remarks. Without statesmen like John Hancock and John Adams and Sam Adams, we had ordinary New Hampshire citizens who were doing the best they could in a moment of crisis to figure out how they should govern themselves. And John Adams did know a thing or two. And the Constitution that he drafted for Massachusetts, which was ultimately ratified in 1780, provided a workable model for the people of New Hampshire. There were a couple of years of experience under it, and it provided the things that the colonists, now citizens of the state of New Hampshire, were looking for. Namely, as Judge Delker said earlier, an emphasis on the people governing themselves independently, and a protection of their rights and interests from the threat of government. A balance that John Adams worked out in a way that continues today, because Massachusetts is the first oldest written constitution in the world, and New Hampshire the second. And both of them predate the US Constitution by a number of years. It's interesting in the work that he and I do with state constitutional law, occasionally, as the judges here in New Hampshire know, to encounter arguments about the meaning of the New Hampshire Constitution based on decisions of the US Supreme Court about the federal Constitution, the Constitution that postdates the New Hampshire Constitution. It really should be the other way around. And the US Supreme Court should be looking to us to figure out what the national Constitution means. There is a great deal of pride that every citizen of New Hampshire should take in having not just the first Constitution, but the second oldest, and two constitutions that have endured in much of their original form for so long. There are scholars who have devoted time to trying to figure out why this is. We've talked about why this is. One of the conclusions that I've drawn after thinking about it and reading about it for a number of years is that if it isn't broken, you don't have to fix it.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Joe Pace. I'm the Executive Director of the American Independence Museum, and I want to thank all of you for coming out here tonight. Who would have thought a couple of days after New Year's on a cold New Hampshire night, 350 people would turn out to learn about historic documents. And by the way, Judge Delker and Professor Friedman, absolutely fantastic. Thankful so much. There have been a lot of people to thank here tonight. I want to add my own thanks to my staff, to Catherine and Rebecca and Callie, who you may have met, who have helped tonight so much in putting all of this on, to our Board of Governors, led by Judge Howard. The American Independence Museum has been here in Exeter for 35 years, and it exists because an original copy of the Declaration of Independence was found at the Ladd Gilman House here in Exeter in 1985. And the Society of the Cincinnati of New Hampshire and the state of New Hampshire eventually agreed that they were going to establish a museum where that document could be used to teach the people of Exeter and New Hampshire and really around the world about the origins of our independence. That museum still exists today. It is undergoing dramatic transformations even now as we begin to tell the story of independence, not just from our origins, but through the decades and generations that followed all the way through today. Because as we talked about, it's not just where we started, it's where we're still going. And independence isn't something that we did, it's something that we do. All of you to please come. We open up back again on May 1. If you've been before, come back. We have new exhibits that we're going to be doing about the Bill of Rights, about the continuing experiment in self-government and our shared heritage in democracy and independence. If you enjoyed this event tonight, folks, this is just the beginning. We're 5 days into 2026. We've got a lot more planned. This 250th birthday is, as the kids say, it's going to be off the rails. And so, we're going to have a good time. I invite you to be there with us. And I also am going to invite one last thing because it's my job. Take a look at the program that you've got with you. And if you flip it on the bottom, on the back, there's a QR code. This was free to the public through the generosity of the New Hampshire Supreme Court Society, and we're deeply grateful for that. We need more help going forward. So if you'd like to help out, that QR code takes you to where you can go to help us out in general, or if you'd like to be involved in underwriting and sponsorship, there are lots of opportunities available. We'll see you all at Independence Festival in July, and stay tuned, check out our website, and stay with us because we have a lot of fun things planned. Thank you all for being here tonight. If you haven't had a chance yet, the document will continue to be on display here, and I've been told there are refreshments in the room back there. And so before you run off, I would request humbly that the 1st New Hampshire Regiment please retrieve the draft Constitution and return it to its spot of honor in the corner.